Hello everyone, welcome back to my Humankind Early Modern Era tier list. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded anything, and I apologize. I had to travel for work on a bit of a short notice, and I haven't been able to play too much of the game recently, or really any game. But I'm back and will be uploading some more videos in the near future. But for now, let's focus on this early modern era tier list. So I'll be discussing all the different parts of these cultures in the early modern era, the legacy trait, the emblematic units, the emblematic district, talk about their impact on the game, and ultimately where I'd rate them. Now, if you're interested in more specifics about how I determined what my ratings are, you can go back and check out my Ancient Era tier list video, and that goes into a little bit more detail about all the different considerations I have when I'm ranking the different cultures. So, without further ado, let's get started. And the early modern era is actually the only era in the game where we don't have a culture that begins with an A. So we are starting with the Dutch. And the Dutch have the legacy trait, +1 money per population on all cities. This is effectively a neutered version of the Teutons legacy trait. So the Teutons in the last era get +1 money and +1 science per state religion follower. That only applies in their own cities. And if you're the Teutons, because of your faith output, pretty much everyone in your state is going to be following your religion. So the Dutch just get +1 money per population, so they're not getting the science. When you pick the Dutch, this will translate to, maybe around 300 money per turn or so. It'll scale up as your population grows and as you conquer more cities later on. It's just an okay legacy trait. In the early modern era, one of the main issues with money is that you really start to feel the cost of inflation. And I'm not sure if this was deliberate on the developer's part, but what seems to happen with money, and we'll talk about this more with another culture as well, is that the money cost to buy things out, it inflates over time. The more you buy things out, the higher the price to buy those things out. So production cost is always the same, right? If I build 10 makers, production cost scales as well, but for units, if I build 10 artillery or whatever it is, the next artillery is still the same production cost. Obviously quarters scale up in production cost, which also affects the money value. But money has additional cost scaling with inflation. And what seems to happen is that when you buy things out, the extra cost that's being added on to inflation is always part of the purchase cost, no matter how much production you've put into something. So if I have one production left and I want to buy it out, I have to pay the full extra cost of inflation plus whatever the monetary value of that one production left on my district is. So it makes money way less effective as the game goes on. It does alleviate a bit near the end of the industrial and going into the contemporary because of how much money scaling there is. Now, the Dutch do have some other aspects about them that really allow them to generate sufficient amounts of money in the right circumstances that they can overcome the limitations of inflation a little bit. And this +1 money per population in all cities, though, yeah, it's fine. There are better legacy traits available throughout the game, though. Whoops. So VOC Warehouse. The VOC Warehouse is an interesting one, and I apologize here. I'm recording this video with my morning coffee. So the VOC Warehouse, I believe back before this was changed, it just gave a straight up +1 money per population on cities, and it was better for the Dutch in that way. Now, two things have changed for the Dutch here. A is that the VOC Warehouse functions completely differently now, and B, money was changed overall to be much less effective. But the VOC Warehouse just gives this base +1 money, fine, whatever. It gives +20 money per adjacent harbor. And this can be quite interesting if you've taken other cultures that give a harbor district as their emblematic district. So say you have a Nost, or you have a Haven, or you have a Kothon, and you have a regular harbor, you can get a decent amount of money for adjacency on the VOC warehouse. You can get plus 40, maybe plus 60 money, depending on how you've placed your harbors exactly. Chances are you've spread out your harbors in order to maximize your growth yields. Unless you were planning to take the Dutch specifically, I usually wouldn't recommend planning around getting a certain culture because it's unlikely they're going to be available, particularly against the AI. They tend to advance very quickly and, take the cultures that you want to pick. Though the early modern era, you should be getting ahead of several other AI at this point. At any rate, perhaps the more interesting thing about the VOC warehouse, in my opinion, is the +2 money per traders. Where the VOC warehouse really excels is when you have a couple really big cities with a lot of territories that are focusing on money, and you are putting a lot of people on traders. So you can stack up like 8 of these in a single city and get +16 money on all your traders, in addition to the +1 money you're getting from the legacy trade as the Dutch. So you're really getting +17 money on your traders. And that's on top of whatever other, base outputs they have. Maybe you chose the Venetians, or maybe you have some other benefits to increasing money output from your traders through infrastructure and that kind of stuff. So the Dutch can get an insane amount of money from traders in like a couple select cities. The VOC warehouse isn't really something that you're going to spam in every single city that you own. And you can get some extra money from harbors, even if you're in a city where you don't have a ton of market quarters or a ton of traders, so you can get a little bit of benefit from it as well. But it's not like a lot of the production quarters or some of the science quarters where you're just going to build it in every single city you own. You're going to be a little bit more selective about it and a little bit more focused. But interestingly, what it is really good at doing, and unfortunately, I think from the early modern era on, the game is really focused around 2 strategies. But the VOC warehouse is really good at making traders very efficient in producing production and science when you pick a production or scientist-focused culture. Because then you can slap on your builder mode or your science mode, and suddenly you're taking all the money that you're producing with your traders and making it into science and production, which are way more effective than money. And traders, they're okay at it if you haven't taken the Dutch and you don't have these VOC warehouses. But if you have taken the Dutch, you could become a bit of a powerhouse later in the game if you pick someone like the French, or you pick someone like the Swedes, or whatever it is that you want to pick, or the Australians and the contemporary, whoever. So the Dutch, they get the money is like, okay, it's decent. You can generate a fair amount of it. You'll be able to buy stuff out. You'll be able to get your merchant era stars, and it's even better if you have a lot of harbors. But really, the main benefit for the Dutch is being able to convert money into science or production very effectively. So let's talk about the emblematic unit. And I believe someone told me this was pronounced like flout in one of my Let's Play videos. And the flout is this naval transport unit. So you don't have to build it. You just kind of get it when you move your armies onto water. Now, what's interesting about it is that it has increased movement speed when you start your turn in allied territories. You get an extra +4 movement speed. So in the early modern era, it is kind of relevant. You will be in a position to invade another continent. You will be positioned to go to the New World in early modern. So the Dutch can get there a little bit faster. It enables them to invade other continents a little bit faster. At the end of the day, is it that much more relevant? Not really. I mean, it's okay. It's nice that it's just a passive upgrade that you don't really have to worry about. But wouldn't you rather have, a land unit that's more effective? Or, even just like a naval unit with extra combat strength? Personally, I would. Yes, I do enjoy the fact that you get somewhere a little bit faster. So, you can do those invasions. You can get to the New World, whatever. But it's saving you like a turn at the end of the day. unless you are dragging units across like the entirety of your own territory over the ocean before you go invade someone. So it doesn't have that much impact in my opinion. There may be an argument that perhaps it's more relevant in multiplayer if you have New World turned on and you can reach the New World faster than other players. And yes, that's true, but both the Umayyads and Norsemen are able to do it before the Dutch. And Joseon can slap on their science mode in the early modern era as well to get access to transports that allow them to cross the seas. So I don't know. I don't see. I see this as a nice sort of side benefit of the Dutch, but the ultimate impact on the game is not very high, even though it's nice to have. So ultimately, I put the Dutch in the B tier, which is a downgrade from the game before it released, where I think I put the Dutch in A. Largely, this has to do with some slight changes to how the Dutch operate in terms of their legacy trade in the VOC warehouse, but more specifically, it has to do with the decreased value of money itself. It's more expensive to buy things out now. The cost inflation is really high, but the Dutch do excel at generating money. They're probably one of the best merchant cultures in the game. You can get a lot of money from picking the Dutch. And you can later, in the following eras, convert that money into better outputs like production and science. Unfortunately, I do think the game kind of revolves around that at the moment, making effective use of that if you're really trying to optimize your play. Now, if you are in a situation where you don't want to abuse that kind of stuff, and honestly, I don't blame you, I really don't like the sort of science and builder mode that those two culture types get. The Dutch are still a decent pick. You don't have to convert the money into other things in order to make effective use of the Dutch. The Dutch will basically guarantee that you're able to get most of your merchant era stars for the rest of the game. And that is ultimately how you win the game, is through fame. So being able to generate stars that perhaps you might not have otherwise been able to generate is always going to be a boon to your ability to win the game. And later on, as you get into the industrial and contemporary and you get some additional scaling on your gold output, you can actually start buying things again. The medieval and early modern are really bad for that. You don't generate enough gold in order to purchase all the things that you want. But as you get more infrastructure online, and particularly in the contemporary, there's some passive benefits to gold generation, like extra gold on your districts, and there's a flat like plus 50% boost to money on all your cities. You can really start buying stuff again. And with the Dutch in particular, it means that if you've taken them in the past, as you go and roll over enemy cities later in the eras, you can instantly build them up into actually being effective functioning cities that the AI don't build. So the Dutch, they're decent. They struggle a little bit on the emblematic unit front, even though the EU they have is nice to get. But ultimately, money is not in the greatest spot right now, so it's hard to put the Dutch above a B, even though they are very good at generating money. So the Edo Japanese. Edo Japanese are an aesthete, and they have the legacy trait +1 influence per population on city or outpost. Apologize, I'm drinking some coffee still. And the +1 influence per population on city or outpost, I mean, it's the same thing as the Dutch, but with influence, right? Except influence is even worse than money. You have to generate a lot of influence in order for influence to be worth it. Again, this is like, I mean, when you first pick the Edo Japanese, it's like plus 300 influence, maybe, depending on, how well you've been playing up to that point and some of your other culture picks. So it's not like a terrible amount of influence right out of the gate. I just don't think it's enough to justify picking the Edo Japanese alone. And, we'll talk about the Terra in a second, but this +1 influence per pop is really your main source of influence generation when you pick the Edo. And influence just doesn't have a lot of applications. So, yes, you claim wonders, but it's not that expensive. There are the civics, but some of the later game civics aren't really as good as some of the early game civics, which seems very strange. Now, civics costs have increased quite substantially, so you do need influence if you want to enact civics. And I do think that there's a case to be made that influence is very valuable indirectly because it allows you to support a larger number of cities over your city cap than someone who doesn't generate a lot of influence. Particularly with the changes to how stability functions, it's really hard to go over your influence cap now for an extended period of time, or to be a negative influence, I should say. And obviously, going over your city cap makes it very difficult to not be a negative influence. So the Edo Japanese, as well as the Ming, who we'll talk about later, generate enough influence that, they might be able to support an extra city or two over their cap. Unfortunately, that's about it. A lot of the things you can do with influence can be done in a different way. So, for instance, merging a city, you can just pillage the city, put an outpost, and then attach it. And you can change your attachment cost to gold, and same with settling outposts. You can change that cost to gold through the use of a civic. So influence, kind of narrow applications. The Edo do generate a decent amount of it through the legacy trait, and if you don't have a lot of gold, this can be nice if you haven't focused on it very much. The other advantage as well is most players are not going to be focusing very much on generating influence era stars. They're very hard to get for some reason, and even like the previous era's aesthetes can struggle to 3-star them because they just don't generate enough influence. The Edo Japanese don't necessarily suffer from the same problem. You will be able to generate at least 1, maybe 2 influence era stars in the industrial and contemporary just on the basis of picking the Edo Japanese through the legacy trait, as long as you have a decent amount of population. And again, like the Dutch, that's how you win the game, right? Is through generating as much fame as you possibly can. But let's talk about the Terra, and I don't like the Terra. I'll just say that flat out. So the Terra gives +3 faith, which is really totally irrelevant by this point in the game. Gives +2 influence as a base, and then +5 influence per adjacent mountain. So it's basically a Confucian school that is in the early modern era and generates a worse output. It's not very good. It relies on there being a lot of mountains nearby, and then you get this extra influence. So, if you have 1 mountain nearby, it's +7 influence. If you have 2, it's +12 influence. It's just too situational. And when we talk about the Ming, we'll see how much better their emblematic quarter is. You will be able to get an okay amount of influence out of this in certain situations where there are a lot of mountains and you're actually able to construct the Terra there. I think the main issue with the mountains is that they're really better served by having an adjacent maker's quarter than an adjacent Terra, just because production is way, way, way more important than generating extra influence, and mountains are very good sources of production generation. So the Terra is pretty limited in where you're actually going to build it, and as a result, you don't end up getting very much influence out of it. It is better than it was, and you do actually have a reason to build this in some situations as you're trying to drive for those aesthete era stars. Maybe you want some civics, maybe you want enough influence to merge cities. And as I've played the game more and more, I found that an interesting and good capability to have is to just take over another city and just immediately merge it into another. And as I'm sure you've noticed, right, there are pretty high influence costs to doing that. And through the use of the Terra and the legacy trait, the Japanese actually have the capabilities to do that on a fairly reliable basis. I just think the Terra specifically is a little bit too situational. The influence output isn't quite good enough for how situational it can be. And specifically when you stack it up against what the Ming gets, it really shows the deficiencies of the Terra. So we'll leave it there for now, and let's talk about the Naginata. So the Naginata is really quite a good unit. It has this 46 base combat strength. It has anti-cavalry. It is a replacement for halberdiers. And it does have honor code like the Varangian Guard. So if you have the Naginata in a army in an army, it can't retreat. The army cannot retreat. But the Naginata, it doesn't have this resource requirement. It's stronger than a halberdier, and changes to gunpowder in particular have made the Naginata even better than it was. So the Naginata, before, one of the main issues was that your entire line of infantry, even your back line, could shoot over your other infantry. So it was always better to just have a bunch of musketeers or whatever it was. Because the thing is that the melee infantry would just get focused down, right, by enemy musketeers or arquebuses or whatever it was. The Naginata now doesn't have that problem, right? Only the front line of gunpowder units can actually shoot other units. The Naginata, with this anti-cavalry bonus, it's also good against certain dangerous units, such as the Pole's Winged Hussars or the Mughals unit, whose name escapes me now. So the Naginata is something that you can always build, right? No resource requirement, has a decent combat strength, gets extra combat strength against enemy cavalry units, and, unlike gunpowder units, it can attack and move at the same time. I do think there are better units available. It is difficult still to make melee really work in the early modern, because the issue with melee units is that they take damage when they attack as well. So you'll attack the enemy, they'll take damage, you'll take damage, and then on their turn, they shoot you, they don't take any damage, and you still take damage. So they end up kind of in a weird position. They do have enough combat strength that they kind of make up for it, and obviously they're very good against certain units, and don't have that resource requirement. They're fine. They're better than some of the other units that are available. I don't value them super highly, even though they're better, just because they're now a melee unit in an era where ranged units are becoming king. You will find some applications for them, though, particularly sort of around your flanks where they're not going to block line of sight, or it's like these big, beefy blocker units that'll prevent enemy units from moving through a choke point or something like that. They will shred arquebuses pretty easily, since arquebuses are much lower combat strength, but once you get up to musketeers and against some of the emblematic units, you'll see some of the deficiencies of still, using melee units in the early modern. So where do I put the Edo? I waffled a fair bit on the Edo Japanese. I think they fall into this weird position where they generate a decent amount of influence, but not quite enough. And particularly when you look at the Ming, you can see how much better the Edo could be in terms of influence generation. I do think the Edo have a better emblematic unit, so it makes it difficult. I still put them in C, largely because their influence output is not really enough to make it worth picking them. The Naginata is an interesting addition, and it's something you can pick if you're like in a really desperate situation where maybe you don't have access to saltpeter and you need a strong combat unit that can match up against other units. I think the main issue, though, is that by the early modern era, if you are that far behind that you really need that unit, you've really messed up somewhere along the way. And there are better options available if you're picking, a culture just for the emblematic unit, as long as you have access to like a very simple resource requirement. So the Edo, like, they combine kind of the influence of the Ming with like a better combat unit of another culture, but I just don't think the combination works very well. It's better to just focus on one thing or another, kind of like you can be an expansionist, you can be an aesthete, whatever. And the Edo just fall into this trap where they don't do either thing quite well enough, because the options that are available that hard focus on the two things they're supposed to do are just better than they are overall. So the Edo, they're not terrible. And honestly, I don't feel bad picking the Edo Japanese, particularly after they fixed the bug where the +1 influence per population wasn't applying properly. It's just that I'd usually rather pick someone else. So the Haudenosaunee are next, and they are an agrarian culture. +1 food on exploitation is their legacy trait. And this is strictly worse than the Harappans in the ancient era. So the Harappans get +1 food on tile and an additional +1 food on river tiles. So the Haudenosaunee, when you get food on exploitation, what that means is the tiles that are being exploited by your district, so the tiles around your districts, but not that contain a district itself. The Harappans +1 food on tile applies to both exploitations and to districts because tiles are all tiles, whether or not they've been built on or not. So the Haudenosaunee have a legacy trait that is strictly worse than a previous agrarian culture. Now, the merits of this are okay if you are exploiting a lot of food. Say you have a lot of harbors, this can provide you a decent amount of extra food. Or if you have a lot of agrarian quarters or a lot of like emblematic quarters that generate food and exploit food specifically. I do think there's an issue here. This should really be at least +1 food on tile. A lot of the food you're going to start to generate from the early modern on is going to come from the districts themselves rather than the exploitations around them. So the exploitations become less and less important as the game goes on, as you start getting adjacency bonuses, as you start getting more districts and have like this really big solid city core. And another issue with food is just it declines in value as the game goes on. You don't need like a bajillion population in your cities. You need like 30 or 40. And beyond that, the food cost of getting higher population, it keeps going up and up and up. So unlike something like production that increases in value the more you have of it, food decreases in value the more population you have, because it becomes harder and harder and harder to get the next population. And money, to a certain extent, suffers from the same problem because of inflation costs. But food in particular, with how expensive it can be to maintain population, starts to decline in value. And you particularly begin to notice this in the early modern. When you look at this +1 food and you combine it with the Three Sisters Plantation, you can get a decent number of food. So the Three Sisters Plantation gives you +5 food per number of attached territories, the +3 food per adjacent farmer's quarter. So if you have an average size city, say you have your core city and 3 attached territories, you'll get the +20 food from the Three Sisters Plantation, you'll get some extra food for adjacent farmers' quarters, and you get the +1 food on exploitations. So, you'll be able to support like an extra couple pops for each Three Sisters Plantation that you have, and with 4 of them, you'll be able to support, say, 7, 8 population, something like that. Where the Haudenosaunee shine as a result of this is when you've picked cultures in the past that are giving you major benefits to your worker slots or your scientist slots or your merchant slots, where you have high populations that are generating a lot of these different outputs. I do think that the food they generate, I kind of wish the food were a little bit more forgiving in terms of how it scales, particularly later in the game. The slots become a lot less important than adjacency bonuses by the time you reach the early modern, particularly for makers and science quarters, where the amount of production and science you're going to generate per quarter substantially outpaces the amount of production and science you're going to generate from having those slots filled by population. and population just gets harder and harder to maintain as the game goes on. Now, the Haudenosaunee, they do generate a decent amount of food. It's just the food is not as valuable as it was before. You're better off focusing on other things because of the different infrastructure that is being applied to things like makers' quarters, to science quarters, to a lesser extent, market quarters as well. Really, and you might think, oh, well, they're really good at getting their agrarian stars, and to a certain extent that's true, but because of how agrarian stars are earned, you're often better off getting the agrarian stars by conquering other people. And it makes things like the Ottomans and the Spanish really just as good at getting their agrarian era stars. So, Three Sisters Plantation, I think in a vacuum, it's fairly average. It doesn't really give you the outputs that you're going to use to win the game. Unlike someone like the Harappans, where the slots are actually fairly competitive with quarters at the start of the game, and can be sort of grown alongside with your other things. You'll have decently sized cities already. The food is less valuable. The other quarters are more valuable. It's just an awkward position to be in, and agrarians kind of suffer from this for the rest of the game. It's not something unique to the Haudenosaunee. I do think they could generate more food, and they'd be just fine, to be honest. They'd be perfectly balanced if they generated more food than they did. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, which is the Rodiscan Rodeka. I think the T's are kind of pronounced as D's. I'm not totally sure. I kind of want to default to my German pronunciation here because of the number of consonants. Anyway, so this is a 970 production unit, which is pretty much in line with everything else in the era. There's 41 combat strength, which is higher than an arquebus. 6 movement, which is pretty good. And really the key component here is that it does have stealth. So it means it can't be seen by units unless those units are adjacent. Also, it can go into other empires' territory, even if you don't have an open borders treaty. So there are some exploration uses to the Rodiscan Rodeka as well. Or Rakeda. I'm getting confused on my consonants here. Anyway, so this unit is a stealth unit. One of the critical things about it, though, is that it unlocks at flintlock. Now, it used to unlock at a different technology that was kind of awkward. Flintlock is a tech you're going to get every game because it gives you access to musketeers and eventually to line infantry. So at least it's in a position where it's at a tech that you are going to want to unlock every game. Where it suffers is because it unlocks a technology that gives you musketeers, you are going to be comparing it to the value of musketeers. So there isn't a resource requirement for this, which is great. Not that you should really struggle to be getting musketeers anyway, but it has much lower combat strength than a musketeer in exchange for stealth. Is that a worthwhile trade-off? In my opinion, no. And one of the major issues with stealth in single player is that the AI know where all your stuff is anyway. So it's not like a player where you can move this thing around the battlefield and they don't know where it is, right? And you enter a strategic position. If you're trying to move it, the AI know it's there, even though you're stealth. The only thing stealth gives you is the inability for them to shoot you unless they actually have line of sight of the unit by being adjacent. So it does allow you to get into some interesting situations where, like, maybe you have this in a position where an enemy can't move adjacent to you, but you can shoot at them, and they can't shoot back at you. How often is that going to be relevant compared to just higher combat strength? Not very often. So, really, the stealth, yes, useful for some exploration. You can get into some interesting positions. But the stealth also drops when you shoot someone. So, even in multiplayer, after you shoot someone, they know exactly where your unit is. Now, it can move and shoot, which is a big advantage over something like the arquebus or the musketeer. And you can't underestimate that. And the way units work in this game, they basically have their unit type, in this case the gunner, and then they have like a single trait. And you'll notice with the arquebus and the musketeer, they have the gunner, and then they have a trait that doesn't allow them to move and shoot. Whereas all the emblematic units, they get a different trait instead, which means they get that trait and they can move and fire. So don't underestimate that effect, the ability of the Haudenosaunee emblematic unit to move and shoot that other sort of generic units don't get. But ultimately, this unit really suffers from being at the same tech as a much more powerful unit in terms of combat strength, because you just want to compare it to that. And the stealth is just not really that effective, particularly against the AI that you're going to be playing against in single player. So, Haudenosaunee, I really want to like them. I think the emblematic unit in particular can be a lot of fun. It's just not as effective as a lot of the other units in the era. The food generation is decent, but the food is less relevant than most of the other outputs you can get your hands on in this era, specifically science and production, and to a lesser extent, money. And because of the game's balanced state at the moment, where everything's kind of just about really converting things into production and science through the use of scientist and builder cultures, food doesn't really directly translate into those things. It indirectly translates through the use of specialist slots, but those specialist slots aren't as good as just having more districts. And having more districts isn't an issue in the early modern, because this is when you get manufactories, so you're never going to really struggle with stability once you get that technology. So the Haudenosaunee are kind of a victim of the game design here, where food just steadily continues to decline in value as the game goes on, and districts start to get exponentially more important in value, particularly in terms of some of the other outputs. So if specialists were ever to change to be a little bit more powerful, or the food scaling wasn't quite as intense, the Haudenosaunee would be a lot better than they are. But for now, I'd usually rather pick most of the other cultures in the era, though we will see the early modern era is a bit bottom heavy. So next up, we have the Joseon, who are a scientist, and I'm going to save discussion of the scientist affinity until the end. Let's just focus on what the culture actually provides for now. So the Joseon provide +3 science on tile producing science. So what this means is that the Joseon are good for people that have already focused on science before entering the early modern era. The Joseon are a culture that really pay off for people that have hard invested in science quarters already and have hard invested in other quarters that might provide science, like the amphitheater or whatever. So the more science quarters that you have, the better the Joseon are as a result of the legacy trait. And personally, I find myself spamming a lot of science quarters in the game. Now, the legacy trait is actually worse than just one of the tier 2 religious tenets that gives you +5 science on your science quarters, but this does stack with the Joseon if you manage to get it. So you can have like +8 science on your science quarters. So if you've picked someone like the Greeks, if you've picked someone like the Umayyads in the previous eras, this will give you a lot of benefit, particularly once you get manufactories and you have a lot of stability and you can really just go absolutely ham on building science quarters. It makes them more effective than they already are. And by the time you exit the early modern era, I mean, you can easily have like 100 science quarters. So an extra 300 science just from the legacy trait, not too bad at all. And this will continue to increase as the game goes on, and you have other things that increase the science output of your cities quite substantially. So you get like +10% from I think 3 different infrastructure, which will continue to help you as the game goes on. Let's talk about the Sowon. Sowon's the emblematic quarter. And the Sowon's interesting. So you get some base science and influence. You get adjacency bonuses from other research quarters, and you get +1 science per researcher. It's basically an early modern era Babylonian emblematic quarter, whose name escapes me, the astronomy house, except you don't get the food on researchers. Now, this is really interesting. If you actually had the Babylonians in the ancient era, you can have some insanely effective researchers with the Joseon, which also gives you the flexibility to take a builder culture in following eras and convert all your science output into production. And these researchers that you can get through that combination specifically are super good. You can easily reach like plus 30 science per researcher if you have a big enough city. Now, the Sowan on its own, though, it's kind of in a strange spot. It's like this mix between wanting to focus on specialists and wanting to focus on just flat science outputs in terms of what the quarter generates. So obviously the Sowan benefits a lot from having adjacent research quarters, right? If you surround it with a whole bunch of research quarters, you can get an additional plus 18 from having other research quarters around it. And then you get that extra science per researcher, which encourages you to have a large population. So the Sowan really benefits from both a large city as well as a large population. Like the Dutch, this is going to be something that you build in like a select number of cities rather than in every city that you own. You're not going to be spamming research quarters in every single city you have. You're not going to have a ton of researchers in every single city that you have. So it's not worth building in every single city. So the Sowan is going to benefit a more selective number of cities where you're really focusing on your science output, unless you are doing some funky stuff where you're deliberately trying to break the game by converting stuff back and forth between research and science through the use of abilities. So the Sowan, it's like an okay amount of science. It's better than a research quarter. It is interesting, I think, that I would consider this maybe average to slightly above average in terms of the actual output benefit that it provides, but it's still better than the average for the early modern era. The early modern era doesn't provide a lot of emblematic quarters that are really, really good at providing outputs. The Dutch, the Joseon, and the Mughals are the main sort of exceptions to that, and to a lesser extent, the Venetians. But sort of as a result of being one of the few emblematic quarters that actually provide decent outputs in the early modern, it kind of raises the stock of the Sowan, even though I think in other eras it wouldn't be comparatively as good as some of the other options that are available. So the emblematic units, which I'll call the turtle ship, is a naval unit, and that's probably all I really need to say about it to give my opinion. Unfortunately, naval units are not very relevant. It does have a 2 saltpeter, 2 copper resource requirement, 45 combat strength, unlocks at naval artillery, and to be honest, naval artillery is a tech I often skip. It does have ramming. So what's interesting about ramming is that when you're in battle, you have extra movement speed. And when you're adjacent to an enemy unit, you get an extra plus 5 combat strength. And this is something you can reliably get between your extra movement and you just move up and get right next to an enemy ship. You blow them up and then you move on to the next one. So unlike the galleass for the Venetians that requires a certain terrain, the turtle ship lets you reliably get the combat bonus, and you will outcompete other units in the same era on your combat strength, unless you're fighting a galleass in the specific terrain it's good in. It's good in games where there's a lot of water and you have to, get over the ocean. The AI do like to build a fair number of naval units, so there is a chance that you'll have to engage in combat. But basically, once you land your melee units and your ranged units on the land, it doesn't really matter anymore. They're really kind of an escort for your melee units to get somewhere and start taking over cities. You can go an entire game without building a single naval unit, and you won't really notice much of a difference. So, how much do I value this? Not much. It's not because it's a bad unit. It's just because naval warfare is not very important. So the Joseon, Decent amount of science output, kind of an okay to bad emblematic unit. I still put them in A. I didn't quite put them in S because I think there is a better culture than them by a significant margin. The main thing with the Joseon, though, is that the scientist affinity completely breaks the game from the early modern era on by allowing you to convert your other outputs into science. You pick the Joseon, you slap on the scientist mode in a few of your cities, it lets you go into the next era so you can start researching industrial era techs, and specifically there are some like infrastructures that really allow you to scale up very rapidly, and suddenly the Joseon are, they're able to run away with the game if you let them. The Joseon, so I put the Joseon in the A rather than S because I'm reluctant to rate these cultures just based on their affinity. I think that the builder and scientist mode are ripe for a balance change in particular. I do think the Joseon, because of their science output, excel over some of the other cultures that are available. But I think without the affinity, the Joseon would probably be like a B tier, to be honest. Like, the amount of science output they generate is fine, but it's not amazing. It's not that much better than some of the other outputs that are being generated by the other cultures in the era. It's just that by being able to get to the industrial era techs, which ramps you up, and just the stupid scientist modes, collective minds that moves your money and production into technology, you just get this stupid amount of science that just allows you to like one turn pretty much every technology in both the early modern and industrial era. So at this point, if you're trying to play optimally and like get to the end game as soon as possible, like, yeah, the Joseon are S tier at that point. You just take all the stupid outputs you have and you slap on your dumb mode, and then you go through the entirety of the tech tree in like 10 turns or whatever. So yeah, Joseon in that respect are S tier. I think without collective minds, they're not very good. I'm trying to take a bit of an average of that here, just because I suspect it'll be changed in the future. So I also don't think it's a way that a lot of people enjoy playing. Me personally, I don't enjoy just like trying to abuse the game mechanics as heavily as possible. I actually want to play the game as it's kind of intended to be played. I find it more enjoyable that way. And in that respect, I actually think the Joseon are more like a B tier. But I recognize for the power gamers out there that the Joseon is an S tier, so I'm kind of taking the average of that. So the Ming are next up, and the Ming they're an aesthete, and they get +1 influence on territory, and they get this reduced cost of enacting and revoking civics. Now, before I said this was totally irrelevant, specifically the cost of enacting and revoking civics, to a certain extent that's still true because civics aren't particularly interesting later in the game. Now, if you are interested in some, they do have much higher costs than they used to, and you will notice the cost reduction from enacting and revoking civics from this legacy trait. This +1 influence on territory, it's literally just recycling the Olmec's legacy trait. At this point in the game, it's not very relevant. I mean, you might get like +40 out of this or something when you pick the Ming. That's just an estimate on my part. I don't actually know. +1 influence per territory, it's just like, who really cares? It's a pretty trivial amount of influence. So legacy trait, it's not great. I don't need to talk about this anymore. I talked about civics already, and the number of territories you own, not that high compared to something like the number of districts or number of pops that you have. So let's talk about really the centerpiece of the Ming, which is the Grand Tea House. So the Grand Tea House gives you +1 influence per district, +10 stability, and +2 influence per adjacent district. So just through adjacency, you can get an extra +18 influence if you completely surround the Grand Tea House. The +10 stability, it's a nice little bonus. You won't notice it very much once you get manufactories, but if you are a smaller culture, perhaps, with not a lot of manufactories, or you don't have a lot of luxuries, that +1 stability is nice to have. The real kicker here, though, is the +1 influence per district. You will easily get cities that have dozens and dozens and dozens of districts. And particularly later in the game, you can easily have a couple hundred districts in a single city. What this means for the Ming is that you can build multiple of these, right? So you have, say, a city with 5 territories in it. You get +5 influence for every single district that you have in that city. The ability of the Ming to generate influence is basically unrivaled by any other culture in the game. If you want influence and you want to get your aesthete era stars, you have to pick the Ming. There's really no alternative for getting those aesthete stars in an efficient manner other than picking the Ming. The Ming's influence generation is going to basically guarantee that you get your aesthete stars for the rest of the game. And ultimately, fame is how you win the game. Grand Tea House, completely unrivaled in terms of influence generation, and it does open up some possibilities that other cultures don't have. I talked about this a bit with the Edo, but the Ming are even better at going over their city cap because of the massive amount of influence you can generate. You can easily be at like +4, +5 cities over your cap, so it allows them to be effectively expansionists in a certain regard by going after cities. But having the extra influence does open up the possibility of doing things like merging cities, which means that you're not going to lose population that you would from ransacking and then attaching an outpost, and you're not going to lose infrastructure that's been built up. You can go and conquer a city, and as soon as you take it, you merge it into an existing city. It allows you to claim wonders, though that really is not a big issue with influence, and it does open up some opportunities to enact certain civics that other cultures might not be able to, though that one's not really a big deal. Ultimately, though, the Ming, because of their influence generation and ability to go over the city cap, and also you don't have to worry about like being culturally inferior to other people. It does have some interesting synergies with things like Statue of Liberty later in the game because you're going to be culturally dominant. So Grand Tea House, yeah, it's the best influence generator in the game, and we'll come back to this when we kind of sum the Ming up. So the rocket cart is the emblematic unit. The emblematic units here, it's interesting. It has 45 combat strength, and it's a heavy weapon, so it upgrades into a machine gun. It needs to have line of sight, but it does have 8 range, and it has the suppression effect. So when you suppress something, the target can't move during its next turn, and it has reduced combat strength. So suppression's a really nice effect. The main problem with the rocket cart is that it needs direct line of sight, just like most other units in the era, other than like the mortar. The other issue is that this isn't shown here, I didn't grab it for some reason, is that you actually need a lot of saltpeter in order to make it effective or to even build it. You need 3 saltpeter for this, which can be a bit difficult to come by in the early modern. You've only just discovered saltpeter. So the likelihood that you have 3 is kind of low, and in fact, most of the time that I pick the Ming, I find myself unable to build the rocket cart unless I have some treaties with other cultures, which I often don't. Sometimes you do, but often you don't. So the rocket cart is kind of difficult to build. Now, if you can build it, it's actually a pretty good unit. You can have a couple of these as support units, particularly if you have like a high ground position, then they're pretty good. But if you put them on the front line, they can't attack against whatever is attacking them. So you need to be kind of strategic with your use of the rocket cart. The rocket cart is, I'd say it's a below average unit just because of the resource requirement, because of the fact it doesn't retaliate against attacking units. It doesn't have indirect fire, so it needs to have clear line of sight to other units, despite kind of being an artillery unit. It's too hard to build, and it's too reliant on very specific combat situations, so most of the time you'd rather just have a generic unit instead. So where did I put the Ming? I do think their emblematic unit is kind of weak, specifically because of the resource requirement for it and being a little too situational. But they're easily the best influence generators in the game. Particularly for the era in which you get them, you can just spam out tea houses, you get a ton of influence, you don't have to worry about your SD era stars for the rest of the game, and that's like an extra, 1.5k influence or something like that. Or not influence, fame, if you get all your SD era stars for the rest of the game from the early modern era on. So, the Ming, you will get a lot of fame that a lot of other cultures cannot get. You'll have some strategic options with your influence, like going over your city cap, like being able to claim additional wonders, like being able to enact cities or merge cities and claim territories more effectively, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, I don't think being the best influence generator in the game is enough to put anyone above a B tier because of how limited influence actually is. So you can, go on your expansionist spree and take other cities. Unfortunately, AI cities tend to be pretty garbage. But, you can get your expansionist era stars more effectively than some of the other cultures can. In addition to getting your SD era stars and, getting a little bit of extra stability. Thankfully for the Ming in the early modern era, you can pretty easily get away with just using generic units because it's unlikely you're going to be able to build the rocket cart. But the Ming do excel at generating a lot of influence. They do it very well with the Grand Tea House. And honestly, when I'm trying to play a game where I maximize my fame, I find myself picking the Ming more often than not. So let's move on to the Mughals. So the Mughals are the builder culture of the era. They get the legacy trait plus 2% industry per number of territories in your sphere of influence on capital. So let's break this down. For every territory that is within your sphere of influence, meaning it is under your culture's influence. So this benefits from someone that has a strong influence output and has spread their influence to other territories that have started cultural conversion. So for every single one of those territories you have that is under the influence of your culture, you get an extra plus 2% industry on your capital. This can really snowball your capital quite effectively if you have a fairly large sphere of influence. All you need is 25 territories under your sphere of influence, which isn't that hard to do, and you get an extra plus 50% industry on your capital. But it's only on your capital. That being said, you really only need like one city to be your production powerhouse to really crank out things like units and quarters. It would be better, obviously, if it were on every single city, but you won't regret having this legacy trait by any means. You can really supercharge your capital, particularly with the ability to turn on the builder mode, whatever it's called, Landraiser, in order to convert other outputs into industry. You can get a pretty crazy capital. You'll be able to spam out tons and tons and tons of districts. But your other cities aren't going to be nearly as effective. There isn't too much else to say on that. Let's talk about the Jama Masjid. The Jama Masjid is, it's really something. It's by far and away the best output-focused quarter in the early modern era. So production is already the most efficient output in most situations. The Jama Masjid really ends up taking it to a whole new level. So you get a little bit of influence, you get a bit of base industry, you get some adjacency for makers' quarters, but really what makes the Jama Masjid is the +3 industry per worker. And workers are slots that you are going to prioritize filling because of how important industry is. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Jama Masjid doesn't actually apply the industry to the workers. So normally when you get a wording like this, what would happen is your worker output increases by +3 industry per worker. The Jama Masjid actually gives the +3 industry on the tile of the Jama Masjid, while workers remain at their same efficiency. So say you were getting +8 per worker and you have 10 workers. When you build a Jama Masjid, you still are getting the +8 per worker, but the Jama Masjid is getting an extra 30 industry from the number of workers that you have. So the Jama Masjid benefits in cities where you have a large number of makers' quarters, which is likely to be every city that you own, and where there are a lot of workers, which is likely to be every city that you own. The Jama Masjid is the spammable quarter of the early modern era. You are going to want to build as many of these as humanly possible to get as much industry as you possibly can. And you get a lot. You will consistently be able to get like 60 or 70 industry or more for every single Jama Masjid that you put down. It's quite a bit more efficient than a Maker's Quarter, and by far blows out pretty much everything else out of the water in the early modern era. It's not even close how much more efficient the Jama Masjid is compared to the other quarters that are available. So the Jama Masjid, it gives you the best output in the game, maybe competing with science. It gives you a lot of it. You want to build it in every single city and every single territory that you can. I mean, there's no reason to not want the Jama Masjid, easily the best emblematic quarter of the era. So let's talk about, finally, the Gajnal, which is the Mughals' emblematic unit. It has 49 combat strength, 2 saltpeter, 2 copper requirement. It is an elephant unit. It is very expensive to produce with almost 2,000 production requirement, but it can move and fire. It does unlock its siege cannons, which is, I believe, in the second tier of technology in the early modern era. So it's a little bit later than things like arquebuses and that sort of stuff, but it's not that much later. And with such a high combat strength and the ability to move and fire, it gives you a major strategic and tactical advantage over other players, particularly because the Mughals are very effective at production, and they can just turn on Landraiser and build like 3 or 4 of these in a single turn or more, depending on how efficiently you've optimized your cities. So the Mughals, you get the Gajnal, you turn on Landraiser, you pump out like 3 armies of these things, and then you're basically unbeatable in the early modern. Because the Gajnal, with the ability to move and fire, it means you can utilize every single one of them that you have on the battlefield. Whereas things like the Janissaries or Conquistadores or rocket carts or Naginata, you can't use all of them because you're limited in your ability to actually make use of frontline tiles and shoot or attack the enemy. But the Gajnal, you can just cycle through even a single tile. And as long as you have a single tile where you can shoot the enemy, you can use pretty much every single unit that you own in order to shoot. So you're able to bring to bear the entirety of your army. It's kind of like having, the Hunnic hordes or the Mongol hordes in previous eras, except they're way, way better. Honestly, the Gajnal combined with the Mughals' ability to generate production, even without having the builder affinity, makes Mughals S tier alone. But the Mughals having the builder ability, honestly, the Mughals completely break the game in a lot of ways. Their ability to spam out tons and tons and tons of districts by activating the builder mode, making massive, massive armies of Gajnals and other things if you need them. The Jama Masjid providing such a massive amount of production. I mean, the Mughals are basically the pick almost every single game. If you're really trying to play the most efficiently as possible, maybe in competition with the Joseon, depending on what cultures you've taken before. But the Mughals are good pretty much regardless of your situation. You can take them every single game that you've played, regardless of your previous culture picks, and you'll still do extremely well. Just because of how much production they offer and the builder abilities conversion of money and science into production and the strength of the Gajnal. You can really just roll over people with the Mughals, just go into the next era pretty easily because, you can use your production to just spam science quarters if you're behind on science. So it's just not even close, really, with the Mughals. They're far and away S tier for the early modern. So the Ottomans are next. The Ottomans are an expansionist. And the expansionist affinity does still suffer from getting stars, but let's talk about the Ottomans generally. Still nursing my coffee. Perhaps the slowest I've ever drank it. So the legacy trait on the Ottomans gives minus 50% industry cost on heavy weapons. This was moved from the Germans in previous versions of the game before release. And the Ottomans also get +3 combat strength on heavy weapons. This is a really good combat strength. I'm not sure what the community opinion on this is generally, but the thing with heavy weapons is that heavy weapons become your go-to in the later eras because they're the units that have indirect fire, specifically mortars and siege artillery, and if you pick the Chinese in the contemporary, you have the Guardians. So siege artillery and mortars are really, really important because they enable you to make use of units that are not on your front line. So in previous eras, in the same way that you would hold on to archers for a long time because of your ability to shoot over units, sort of the same reason, that you'd hold on to Markabatas and certain other emblematic units that have indirect fire, like the Samnahaya with the Morians. You want to build a lot of mortars, and later in the game, in the next era, you want to build a lot of siege artillery because you can fill your back tiles with it and be able to make use of all of those units. They're going to be a unit that you spam a lot of, and the Ottomans are very, very effective at producing them, and they make them more combat efficient as well. So with the Ottomans, it allows you to really crank out these very combat effective units. I would recommend skipping the howitzer. You don't want the howitzer because it is not indirect fire. But the siege artillery and mortar are boosted significantly by the Ottomans' legacy trait, and they're one of the most important units for you to be building. So overall, I do value this legacy trait fairly highly. So let's talk about the Sultan Kami, which is the emblematic quarter. Gives +1 faith per district, +3 influence, and +3 influence per adjacent district. Changes to religion have slowed the religious pace down a little bit. You won't always have all your religious tenets by the time you reach the early modern era, perhaps unless you've taken the Teutons. But for the most part, the AI, if they are going to get tenets, they already have gotten them because they really like to build holy sites. So what the Sultan Kami ends up doing for you is letting you get the tenet a little bit faster, but doesn't actually enable you to get more options than you otherwise would have. I don't really like the district very much. Faith is kind of irrelevant at this point in the game. The only exception is if you have the Angkor Wat and you can generate a ton of food, particularly if you combine that with Machu Picchu. So Sultan Kami, Faith, not very important. You likely have all the tenets you need at this point, and even if you don't, it's not really giving you additional options because all the AI that are going to have tenets already have them. So Sultan Kami, it's pretty much a wasted quarter by this point in the game. So let's talk about the Janissary. And the Janissary is pretty insane, to be honest. So it is a unit that unlocks at Gunpowder Warfare, which is the very first tech, where most other cultures unlock the arquebus. It has 44 combat strength, which is +5 over an arquebus, reasonable resource requirement of 1 iron and 1 saltpeter. It's a gunner unit, just like other units of the era. And it also has siege mastery. So when it's participating in an assault where you're attacking an enemy city, or if you're sorting out from your own city, you have 47 combat strength instead of 44. The Janissary also, because it has this trait, means that it can move and fire, unlike the arquebus and musketeer, which makes them significantly more combat effective. So you have this 47 combat strength unit, significantly better than the arquebus, situationally better than even the musketeer, depending on if you're doing a sortie or an assault, which at this point of the game is going to be most of your battles. Fairly reasonable production cost. It can move and fire. Janissaries are an excellent, excellent, excellent unit for an expansionist. It gives you every single tool that you need between the Janissaries and the Ottomans' legacy traits to just roll over enemy players. Perhaps the one that will give you like a major resistance would be the Mughals, but everyone else, it's very hard to compete with the Ottomans' military. The only disadvantage to the Janissaries is that you have to hard build them. You can't upgrade them from another unit, so as soon as you reach the early modern and you get the tech, you probably want to build an army full of these guys, because there's not really a lot that can compete with them. And then you get a supporting army with like a bunch of mortars or whatever at a significantly reduced discount and with your extra combat strength. And you have a culture that is very hard to stop. Now, I put the Ottomans in A tier, and I think the Ottomans are someone that you pick when you're sort of even to ahead with other cultures, and you really just want to start snowballing either more or start your snowball if you haven't already. I think the Ottomans are a bad pick if you're behind and need to catch up, because the Janissary is something that you have to hard build. If you're behind on tech, other cultures are going to have more effective counters to your units. Musketeers are much less capable of much more capable of resisting Janissaries than something like the arquebus. So if you're like even to ahead on tech or even to ahead on military, you're generally keeping pace or generally ahead of the average pace of the game and your neighbors, the Ottomans are a really excellent pick. If you're behind, they're kind of okay. They can give you a tactical edge to try to catch up by taking some cities off cultures that may be a little bit more technologically advanced to you or may have more production or better armies. But the Ottomans are really, I think they're probably one of the best expansionists in the game. The relative value of their legacy traits and the Janissaries compared to other cultures is very good. The legacy trait is relevant for the entire game because of how prominent siege artillery is in its late game role as an indirect fire unit that's fairly effective. So Ottomans, yeah, they're good. They're good. Definitely place them above the Dutch and the Ming for sure. So let's talk about the Poles, who are a militarist. And the legacy trait is an interesting one. We'll get into a little detail on this. This used to be just the extra district fortification on districts. It still provides this. It's plus 10 district fortification, but you also get plus 2 stability on districts. So this is very similar to the Zhou in the ancient era. So the plus 10 district fortification. Let's talk about fortification for a second, because this sounds better than it is. And when I initially rated the Poles, even though I put them in the D tier in the beta, I actually thought that district fortification, the more you have of it, the higher combat strength you get from being in fortification. Unfortunately, this is not true. The way fortification works is that when you have a unit in a fortified position, you get a combat strength bonus against other units that are not inside the fortification, so long as you have any fortification on that tile. So when you have a unit that's outside your city and they attack into you, you get a combat strength bonus regardless of if you have 1 fortification or if you have 10,000 fortification. It is the same combat bonus. The difference district fortification makes is that it makes it harder for enemies to tear down your fortification through the use of things like artillery. So basically, what I'm saying here is that this is pretty much useless in single player. The issue is that your district fortification is pretty much never lost because the AI don't really build many siege units, like mortars and howitzers and that kind of stuff. And even when they do, you tend to have enough fortification naturally, especially if you've built like walls and some other stuff, which you can easily do in like a single turn in the early modern era. You have enough fortification to resist a couple attacks anyway. And in fact, I found even when I have high fortification, if I'm in a really bad defensive battle, my units will die before my fortification does, and the enemy can just like walk in anyway. So this fortification, if fortification provided combat strength, I think this would be a lot better. But as it is now, having extra a plus 10 district fortification doesn't really matter that much. It's just not important. So let's talk about the stability quickly. And normally I'd be like, wow, plus 2 stability on districts, that's great. You can build bigger cities and all that. And to some extent, it is still a decent trait. I think the main issue here is that in the early modern is when you get access to the most important technology in the game, which gives you manufactories. And once you get manufactories, you pretty much never have to worry about stability ever again. So if you don't have a lot of resources, kind of like the Ming with the plus 10 stability on their tea house, the plus 2 stability on district is nice to kind of boost you up a little bit if you're struggling with access to luxury resources. But that's kind of a situation where you're already behind in the game if you don't have that and you're desperately trying to catch up. And I think there are better picks than the poles if that's the situation that you find yourself in. So plus 2 stability on district, it's nice, particularly if you have if you have a late game situation where there's a lot of pollution and you might have some difficulty with stability, but it's really just overshadowed by manufactories is the main issue. If this came, earlier in the game, this would be a lot better. But in the early modern era specifically, it's not that impactful. So let's talk about the Barbican. The Barbican is basically a garrison that prevents adjacent tiles from being ransacked. That's about what it does. It has a little influence and some stability and the adjacent combat strength in that. But it prevents adjacent tiles from being ransacked. Let me ask you this. How many games have you played against the AI where you've thought, from the early modern era on, where you've thought, gee, I wish I could stop these enemies from ransacking me without committing any units? Because for me, the answer is this has never happened to me. And so the Barbican kind of fills this niche to me that doesn't need to be filled. At the point of the game where you're in the early modern era, where you'd be constructing the Barbican, you should have enough armies and enough power to deal with enemy armies without needing to commit an entire emblematic quarter just to stop people from pillaging you. And how much value is that even anyway, right? Say they do pillage you. Well, just go back and pillage their outpost again and reattach it. It's not that big of a deal. And then your cities are usually so big anyway that all your core outputs are protected because your outposts are connected to your city through districts, so they have to siege your city anyway. The Barbican's it just fills a role that doesn't really need to be filled, in my opinion. And garrison districts in particular, because they don't really provide any extra outputs, tend to be some of the worst emblematic quarters in the game anyway. So Barbican, I don't know. When I've played the poles, I've built a few for the fun of it, but have I ever really needed it? No, I don't think so. So the Winged Hussars are the pole's emblematic unit, and the Winged Hussars are actually pretty good for a few reasons. So they're 970 production. They unlock at centralized power, which means that they unlock at attack in an earlier era. So you're likely to already have access to these as soon as you pick the poles. They have 46 combat strength, 6 movement. They're a cavalry unit, 2 horse and 2 iron, which early modern era shouldn't be a problem. They have Charge Master, which means when charging, the target they're hitting can't retaliate. They also have a bonus combat strength, like any heavy cavalry unit when they're attacking non-adjacent enemies. So when they get a charge, they have 49 combat strength, which is plus 10 over something like an arquebus, or plus 8 if you're playing on Humankind difficulty. So the Winged Hussars, I kind of slammed them before for being a cavalry unit. That's still true, particularly in the early modern era where cities start to take up much larger portions of the map than they did before. You can't charge into enemy cities, and sieges are going to be most of the battles that you fight in the early modern and beyond. However, the Winged Hussars have benefited significantly from a change to the way that early modern and gunpowder combat in general operates. Now that units can't shoot over each other, like, line infantry and musketeers and that kind of stuff, it means that only the front line is really able to shoot. One of the issues the Winged Hussars had before is once you committed them, it was very easy for an enemy to just focus fire all their shots onto the Winged Hussars, and your Winged Hussars would just die. That is not something that can really happen anymore. You can't utilize all of your firepower to just shoot the winged hussars, and it's made the winged hussars a lot more dangerous in the situations where they're actually able to be utilized, specifically in field battles and in defensive sieges. So the winged hussars are actually quite capable of dealing with what should be a counter, like the halberdiers. They can really decimate things like arquebuses. They do reasonably well against musketeers, at least until, the AI get the ability that allow units to dig in. Then it becomes a little bit more of a problem. But the winged hussars are decent. You will be able to make very effective use out of them to get around enemy lines and hit backline units like mortars to hit arquebuses. They're what's supposed to be a direct counter. Kind of is, but kind of isn't. It depends on who has the initiative there, whether you attack first or they attack first. So where they really struggle, though, is in offensive sieges. You're not going to get a lot of value out of these. But in defensive sieges and in field battles, winged hussars, they're probably one of the better units on the battlefield. And if you have, even 3 or 4 of them, because of their mobility, because of their high combat strength, because of Charge Master in particular, which means they don't take damage when they attack, it gives them a lot more staying power after they attack. It allows them to flank around enemies. It allows you to use more units than you might otherwise be able to. Now, before I did rate the Poles in the D tier, I think the extra stability and changes to combat and how that affects the winged hussar have moved them up to C. I do still think it is a low C. I think they are the culture that I am least likely to pick in any given game from the early modern era. I don't think they're bad enough to be D at this point. Winged hussars in particular are very potent now that they can't just get focused fired down, and the extra stability that they get on their legacy trait is nice to have, even if it's not strictly necessary with the manufactories. But the Poles, I'd still rather pick the Edo or Haudenosaunee in most games just because of the extra outputs that those two cultures provide. Poles are they're obviously a defensive culture, right? And I think they probably have more uses in multiplayer, even though I'm not really a multiplayer player very much myself, where, you really need to defend against a superior foe. They give you some options in that regard to prevent them from pillaging, and your winged hussars can be quite effective. But I do think even in those situations, something like the Naginata, while also getting some influence output, or something like the Ottomans for the Janissaries are probably better options in those situations as well. So Poles, C tier, they're not completely irredeemable. They do have some options, but I still rate them pretty low just because they don't provide any outputs. The winged hussar does become dated, and can't really participate in offensive sieges, and the Barbican is just not very useful. So the Spanish are next, and the Spanish are another expansionist, making for 2 in the early modern alongside the Ottomans, and the legacy trait gives +3 combat strength on units starting their turn in a non-allied territory. Nursing my coffee a little more. Only halfway done, which is pretty impressive for me. I got this pumpkin spice cold brew, so I'm being a little basic right now. But anyway, the Spanish are very competent expansionists. So this +3 combat strength on units starting their turn in a non-allied territory means that you declare war, you walk into the enemy territory, and on the next turn, all your units in those armies have +3 combat strength. So this is enough to counteract and even surpass the Humankind difficulty combat strength bonuses that the AI are going to get. So every single unit that you have can benefit from this. It doesn't matter what it is. It applies to everything. What this means is that the Spanish have this, when you take the Spanish in, you have this legacy trait for the rest of the game. When you are attacking, you basically have a permanent +3 combat strength on your units. Assuming you don't just go directly from your territory to an enemy city. You can wait a turn to get that extra combat strength. Yeah, it's a good legacy trait. Now, obviously, it's not as versatile as just a straight combat strength bonus, right? Because you don't get it defensively. But in the early modern era is really where you should be starting to surpass the AI quite significantly in terms of your combat strength and unit strength and ability to, produce and preserve units. The AI tend to lose a lot of units in combat where the player can preserve them. And this +3 combat strength really enables you to just roll into the AI's territory, to siege their cities, to knock out their armies, and just keep snowballing your advantage. And honestly, in the early modern era, do you need it? No, but it's going to make your life way, way, way easier. And it enables you to get away with, using fewer armies than you might normally need. But I think what's really important in the early modern is because of the dawn of firepower, it becomes more important to squeeze as much combat strength out of units as possible, because you can only utilize a very small number of them along your front line in order to shoot. So cramming a ton of combat strength onto a fewer number of units is quite potent because you can't utilize all your units until you unlock stuff like mortars and siege artillery in the industrial era. So let's talk about the Cathedral Gotica for a second. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. This suffers from the same issue as the Sultan Kami with the Ottomans. It just gives faith. It has the same problems as the Sultan Kami does, where it doesn't really... It gets you your tenets a little bit faster, but it doesn't really unlock the ability to get extra tenets over over the AI, because the AI, if they're going to get their tier 4 tenets or their tier 3 tenet, they already have them at this point in the game. So it's not really making you more competitive. It just lets you get what's remaining a little bit faster. The AI often leave the +2 combat strength from having a different religion open, and that's good with the Ottomans too. But the thing is when you build these and you start spreading your religion, it makes the AI more likely to convert to your religion, which means you don't have the +2 combat strength against them. So really what ends up happening is that food cultures are better for that trait in particular, and they're better at getting tenets than like religious focused cultures, because you're likely to maintain religious control of your own territory. And what you need is more population following your religion in order to get tenets rather than more faith. And in particular, with changes to faith after earlier versions of the game, there isn't really much benefit to spreading your faith to other cultures. There aren't a lot of synergies with like co-religionist states and that kind of stuff. So there's not a lot of incentive to have like this uber strong faith. You just need enough to control your own territories, really. And the Cathedral Gotica and Sultan Kami just, they don't matter at this point in the game. If I pick the Spanish, I will build these for fun. If I'm ahead, just because I like building the emblematic quarters and they look kind of cool, but you don't really need to build these at all. So let's talk about the Conquistadores. The Conquistadores are kind of an arquebus replacement. They have 43 combat strength, which is +3 over a normal arquebus. They have gunner, just like a normal arquebus. And they have El Dorado, which allows them to generate more money from winning battles and ransacking. Now, I haven't tested how this works with things like having a bunch of Nos. So the Nos, for instance, provides +50 gold when you ransack. And El Dorado is supposed to double the amount of money you generate from winning battles and ransacking. What I don't know is if this applies to like the base value of the ransack, or if it applies to a modified value. So, if say you get 50 money from ransacking, and you have, 2 Nos giving you +100, does the double apply to just the base, so you'd get 200 gold, or does it apply to the everything after it's been modified? So with 2 Nos, you'd have a base of, say, 150, and then that's doubled to 300. Either way, I don't think it matters too much. Particularly winning battles, it's not like you get a ton of money anyway. It's nice to generate a little bit of extra income. El Dorado is definitely not as good as the Janissaries traits that they get. But keep in mind, the Spanish have their legacy trait where they get the +3 combat strength in non-allied territory. So oftentimes the conquistadores are going to be at 46 combat strength. And additionally, because they have the El Dorado trait on the conquistadores can move and fire, unlike their generic unit counterparts in the early modern era, which is really important. I can't overstate how important that ability is. So the conquistadores really end up being very competitive with the Janissaries between the legacy trait and the ability to move and fire, and the overall combat strength that you can expect from these guys. They're very marginally worse than the Janissaries in terms of sieges. They have very slightly lower combat strength, but the advantage that you're getting with the Spanish is that for the rest of the game, every unit you have that starts its turn in enemy territory is going to have additional combat strength. And for that reason, I put the Spanish in the A tier. I think they are marginally worse than the Ottomans in the era in which you get them, because the Janissaries are slightly better. The legacy trait for the Ottomans lets you get a lot of mortars. Let you get a lot of siege artillery, some extra combat strength. But the Spanish have a slightly more potent legacy trait as the game continues to play out. So I put the Spanish in the A tier along with the Ottomans. So the final culture is the Venetians, and the Venetians are the second merchant culture of the era alongside the Dutch. And they have a legacy trait, +1 money per number of trade routes on city or outposts, and +2 money per number of naval trade routes. So if you have a lot of trade routes, you'll generate some extra money out of this. How much money will you generate? Say you have 40 naval trade routes, which is a fair bit. It's not very often I have that many trade routes in a game. But say you have 40 naval trade routes, you'll get +80 money. Compare this to the Dutch, who get +1 money per population, where I said it was an okay legacy trait. The Dutch, with +1 money per population, can reasonably expect like 200 to 300 money from the moment they pick the culture. The Venetians probably can't. Even if you have 100 trade routes and they're all naval, you will get +200 money. And because they are trade routes, they're subject to being, they're subject to disappearing because of things like war declarations. They're subject to, getting destroyed because of independent cities or people you're at war with, that kind of stuff. So the legacy trait is really just not as good as the Dutch. And this is going to be a theme with the Venetians, just that they're not as good as the Dutch. So let's talk about the Bottega di Artisti. And this is better than it was. It gives +4 influence, +1 money base, +1 influence per adjacent market quarter. So it gets a little bit of influence along with the money. And the most important part of it is that it gives +1 money on tile producing money. So what this means is that for every Bottega that you have, all your merchant quarters and all the tiles that you have that produce money, if you have other tiles other than merchant quarters that are doing so, are going to get 1 extra money. So say you have 5 of these in your city, you get +5 money on your merchant quarters. Additionally, this can stack with the religious trait that gives +5 money on market quarters. So you can really generate quite a bit of money on your market quarters. The main problem I have with the Bottega is that it's worse than the VOC warehouse. So imagine you have a city where you have 20 market quarters. If you have that many market quarters, it's likely you are hard focusing on money, which means that you have your population working the merchant slots. For every VOC warehouse that you have, if you have no harbor bonuses on the VOC warehouse, you need 2 Bottegas for every 1 VOC warehouse to get the same amount of money. And if you have harbors in your city, you need even more Bottegas. So the Bottegas are, unless you have no population in your city or you're not working traders for some reason in your city that's specialized in producing money, The Bottega is pretty much strictly worse than the VOC warehouse. You do get a little bit of extra influence, but even like with the maximum number of market quarter adjacencies, it's plus 10 influence. And even on, if you have 5 of these, you get plus 50 influence. I mean, who really cares about that, right? So the Bottega, it's basically strictly worse than having the Dutch. Again, just like the legacy trait. So that's rough. So let's talk about the only advantage the Venetians have, in my opinion, which is the Galleass. So they have a real combat unit. Unfortunately, it's a naval unit, but it is a very strong naval unit. So the Galleass has 39 base combat strength, but when it's in coastal waters, you get plus 11, which means you have 50 combat strength in coastal waters. This can be very good at enabling coastal invasions. You can use this to support your units as they invade enemies. You can use this to take out enemy units that are patrolling the coast or defending your own waters. Unfortunately, like I mentioned with the Joseon, you can pretty much go an entire game without ever building a naval unit. It's not very relevant, which is just unfortunate. It's something that 4X games have always struggled with, making naval combat very relevant compared to land combat. So the Galleass, yeah, it's a great unit when it's relevant. Unfortunately, it's not relevant very often. So Galleass overall, I would rate it fairly below average for if you're considering all units, though for a naval unit, it is above average. It's just that naval units are not very important. So overall, Venetians, and I talked about the woes of merchant cultures already with how money scales and all that. The Venetians are really just a worse Dutch. Their ability to generate cash is not as good. They do generate a little bit of extra influence from the Bottega that the Dutch don't get, but the Bottega's influence isn't very high, and the influence is one of the least important outputs in the game already. Basically, its main purpose is at the start of the game to claim and attach territories, and then by the end of the game, it's really just to get aesthete era stars, and the Venetians don't give you enough influence to reliably get that. The Galleass is an above average naval unit, but naval units are kind of bad. The Venetians are really just like the discount Dutch in a lot of ways. I do have fun playing them. The Galleass can be a lot of fun. I do like seeing the numbers on my market quarters pump up, but ultimately, if you're playing a merchant game and the Dutch are available, just pick the Dutch. So that is the final tier list for the early modern era. I struggled a bit with the early modern era, specifically because of how much the builder and scientist culture start to break the game a bit. I do think there is a massive power difference between the top tiers and the bottom tiers in this era as well. The Joseon and Ottomans and Spanish are like pretty much leagues ahead of the Dutch and Ming in a lot of ways, and the Mughals have this massive power advantage over pretty much everyone because of the lack of really strong outputs in this era. So it made it a little bit difficult to tier. But anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know if I missed anything. I am just coming back from work, so I'm sure a lot of these, a lot of the more subtle details have escaped my mind for the time being, since I haven't been able to play a ton, haven't been able to play as much as I normally have. So if you have any additional thoughts on how I've rated these, or about any specific, legacy trait or unit or quarter or anything else I might have missed, let me know in the comments below. And I know there is a balance patch that's supposed to be coming out near the end of the month. I don't really want to make a new video. I'll probably leave my thoughts in like a pinned comment on this video once the balance patch is released and I get the chance to play with it a little bit. So thanks for tuning in. Look forward to a couple more videos in the not so distant future, and I'll see you next time.